and also thank you again, like Marco did to the participants in Occupy Lincoln who were gracious hosts for discussion this afternoon. What I want to talk about today really starts from an hypothesis that the current economic crisis is also a social crisis, and that social crisis is manifest or recognizable in a series of subjectivities or faces of subjectivities that are both produced by the crisis and reproduce the crisis. And those are what I'll talk about in a minute. It'll be the main focus, I suppose. But I would also like to speak, like Marco suggested, about the current cycle of struggles, about the movements that started in 2011. And really, what I will get to is the ways in which I think that these movements are, if not antidotes to the subjectivities produced by the crisis, that they have the possibility of inverting those qualities of the depotentialized, of the disempowered subjectivities that are produced in crisis. So first, before starting, I want to say something about this cycle of struggles, that started in 2011. And so I'm linking together protest movements, starting from the Tunisia rebellions in December 2010 to the Egyptian ones in January in the occupation of Tahrir Square, which spread then, of course, to other countries in North Africa and the Middle East, and then left in some ways to Spain, starting with the so-called 15M movement, the 15th of May of 2011, the occupations of especially the central squares in Madrid and Barcelona, also then to the occupation of Syntagma Square in Athens, and then finally in September to Occupy Wall Street and the proliferation of Occupies. Now I want to think of these as a cycle of struggles, although of course you know that all these ones I mentioned already are very different and very deeply rooted in their own national questions. Like of course the rebellions in Tunisia and Egypt against a dictatorship are very different than the rebellion in Spain in May against a socialist government, also a socialist government in Greece for the occupations in Syntagma, and then well actually some people would say a socialist government in the US for Occupy Wall Street, but nonetheless a Democratic Party government in the US. So you'd say these are very different, but why would one call them a cycle? Like how could one link them together? One of the things I think is interesting about that is that the movements themselves saw the others as inspiration for them, so that quite clearly that the uprising against the Mubarak regime in Egypt saw the insurrection against Ben Ali in Tunisia as a very direct inspiration, and then jumping by May to Spain, in some ways that encampment of Puerta del Sol in Madrid thought of themselves as repeating Tahrir Square. Similarly with Syntagma Square in Athens, and then finally by the time we arrive at Wall Street, in New York they have the whole year at their backs as inspiration for them. So what I think of as a cycle of struggles is not a mere repetition of the same, but rather translations and inspiration of common tactics and goals. Sometimes it transforms quite dramatically, so that some of the early discussions for the Occupy Wall Street was thinking how, whereas in Tahrir Square they were opposing a tyrant, here we're opposing the tyranny of finance. So that kind of translation goes on. And yet there were many common aspects to the movements of the entire cycle of struggles. And that's what I want to focus on just for a minute before really getting started with the lecture. In fact, what I thought could be useful is the way that the characteristics of the movements of this cycle, let's call them the cycle of 2011, although I hesitate to do that because they're still continuing in 2012. So the ones that began in 2011. I want to the three characteristics that, in their relationship to the altered globalization movement that started 10 years ago. So by altered globalization movement, I mean that globalization protest movement that was first gained wide visibility in the Seattle protests against the WTO in November 1999, and then continued at a long series of summit meetings against the World Bank and the IMF, against the G8 meetings, against the Free Trade of the Americas, etc. That went on at least until the Genoa G8 meetings in summer of 2001. So here, I thought it could be helpful for clarifying three aspects that I see as defining or common to the 2011 cycle struggles in their relationship to the altered globalization movement. Okay, so the first one is something that they share in common that I think was developed during the altered globalization movement and now common to this cycle of struggles, which I would call a multitude form, which you might contrast to the party form. And what I mean by that is that all of these movements, both the altered globalization ones and the ones in the past year, have experimented with democratic organizing in a horizontal network structure. In other words, a kind of organizing and decision-making that doesn't involve centralized leadership, and nor does it involve hierarchy or a unified program, but rather is, like I said, it constructs methods for collective decision-making without leaders or even spokespeople, and works through not a homogeneous, but a plural internal constitution. Okay, that sounded more complicated than it needs to be. What I mean is that it's not a uniform group that all believe the same thing. There's no party line. Rather, there are very different groups that come together and work together while believing very different things. So here's one example, just to give you an idea of that. You know, during the 18 days of the occupation of Tahrir Square in Egypt, in the US press and the foreign press in general, each day they were looking for a leader. Like out reading the New York Times every day, they hypothesized this guy must be the leader. Like one day it must have been al-Baradei, the Nobel Prize winner. Another day it was that Google executive. Another day they had pictures of 5 people that one of them must be the leader, either in the square or behind the scenes. And what they couldn't understand is, in fact, there was no leader, but rather there was a complicated relationship among groups in the square that were collectively making decisions, often conflicting with each other, but making decisions collectively in a horizontal, you see what I mean by horizontal rather than vertical? A horizontal network structure. The entire construction throughout the last year of general assemblies and working groups are precisely mechanisms for that, for making decisions. So it's not a group that can't make decisions, but making decisions in a collective and open manner, without centralized leadership or a single agenda. Because that's the other characteristic of this multitude form that I think is common both to the altered globalization movements and the movements of the last year, the encampments, which is the heterogeneity of groups involved. So that one of the sense that this term multitude has for me is that it's an internally different, a multiplicity that's involved. So that some people, if you go around to the different encampments of the US and the different occupies, you'll of course find, there'll be Ron Paul supporters, there'll be anarchists, there'll be Obama supporters, any number of very different things, but they'll manage to, or this is as best they can, work together and make decisions together collectively. So that's what I mean by the internal differentiation and the lack of leadership. That's what I'm calling multitude. So that's one thing that I think links the struggles from Tunisia and Egypt to Madrid, and Athens, and to the entire US occupation. And something that links it to also the experiments in this, in the altered globalization movement in Seattle, Genoa, etc., 10 years ago. Okay, second characteristic, which is I think different from the altered globalization movement, which was the altered globalization movements, and if you don't either remember them or know them, I think the description I gave you was enough, really, that they were essentially summit-hopping movements, that they were in many ways the same activists that would move from one summit to the next and protest that summit. And so they were fundamentally nomadic, constantly moving around. And in contrast, one of the really important aspects, and obvious I suppose, of the movements of the last year is their sedentary nature. They're not nomadic. In fact, they refuse to move, which is their characteristic. And in that sense, they're also deeply rooted in local issues and local events. So that, in fact, what I think this is some of the sense of, or importance maybe for me of thinking about something in terms of a cycle of struggles like I was describing before, which is it's something, the movements of the last year have really become properly global while remaining incredibly locally rooted. So that they're become global in their extension, in their inspiration, in their contagion even, while remaining all the time very local. So in that sense, rather than nomadic, they're sedentary or rooted. And the third, which probably one should have more to say about, but I think I'll just pose it and then move on, is that in general, 10 years ago in the ultra-globalization movement, the primary objective was usually posed in terms of justice, posing it as a global justice movement or environmental justice, or justice was a key concept. One of the things that interests me a lot, and I'll talk about later, in the past year, is the way that democracy, rather than justice, has functioned as a key term and a key aspiration. I'll come back to that in a minute if it probably does require more explanation. Okay, so like I said, my general hypothesis and the movement of what I'm going to say now is, first I want to characterize what I'm calling these four subjectivities of the crisis, or created by the crisis. The way the crisis creates us, maybe that's where I put it. And then I want to return to those four subjectivities of the crisis, and the ways that they are affected or even possibly inverted by the movements of the last year. The way that the occupations and encampments have the potential to transform who we become in the crisis. I hope that makes some sense. Okay, so here you go. The four subjectivities I want to talk about are the indebted, the mediatized, the securitized, which I'll explain in a minute, and then the represented. The first one, the indebted, maybe is the most easily accessible. Debt, and the idea is that debt creates a certain subjectivity in us. Now, to start, it's worth recognizing that, and maybe quite obvious, that debt has become a universal or at least general condition in the U.S. That it's almost impossible to live today without debt. You have to go into debt to go to university. You have to go into debt to get health care. You have to go into debt to buy your car. To buy your house, certainly. That becoming indebted has become a general condition. In other words, in order to live, you have to be in debt. In some ways, also, we've moved from welfare to debt fare. Like, even in a very precise way, that the same things that were given by welfare, that were provided by welfare, health, housing, etc., are now ones that we have access to through debt. Debt is primarily a relation of inequality, and a relationship of inequality on its surface. It's interesting to think, or I find it interesting to think about how, when one thinks about our economic relationships in terms of debt, rather than exchange, one gets a different view. Like the primary fiction of capitalist society, it's both in normal economics books, but also the ones that Marx starts his analysis from. The fiction of capitalist society is one of equality and freedom in equal exchanges. So that what we have in the labor relationship are two commodity owners who appear in the market and make equal changes. That the worker exchanges labor power with the capitalist for the wage. And then Marx starts that way, that in fact the way Capital, the books, starts is by both posing and valuing in some ways the equality and freedom of that relationship of exchange, and then recognizing how that equality and freedom of it are in some senses false. Debt, in the contrast, has the virtue of revealing immediately the inequality of our relationships. So, whereas in that relationship of exchange that's a basis of capitalist ideology or even capitalist functioning, in that relationship of exchange, the inequality is hidden, while in ways that our productivity or the productivity of labors is made clear. Whereas in debt, it seems to me that our productivity is hidden, whereas the inequality is made clear and on the surface. In some ways, the Occupy Wall Street, one might ask, why did the slogan of 99% become so generalized so quickly? And I think it's in part due to the fact that the inequality of our relationships have due to debt in particular, have become so present. Okay. Debt also creates bonds. Let's see, I should put it this way, really. In some ways, let me pose this again in terms of the way Marx starts talking about, the way Karl Marx starts talking about capital. When he talks about primitive accumulation or the passage to capitalist society, he says in some ways he characterizes rather ironically the new wage worker as double free. He calls the wage worker bird free. Double free, on the good side of it is that the wage worker is free in the sense of not enslaved, free of the bonds of servitude. On the other hand, he says the wage worker is free in the sense that he or she has nothing to sell but their own labor power. Bird free in that sense. It seems to me that the predominance of debt has in some ways returned us to the relationships of bondage. Not the same as the bondage of the pre-capitalist era, but in some ways wage workers are no longer free in that first sense, that they are immediately defined by their debt and bound by it. Debt, of course, now is obviously also a subjective state, a process of production of subjectivity through morality or discipline. It's probably no coincidence that debt in German is the same word as guilt, and that in a way the subjectivity that's created by your indebtedness is that guilt or responsibility. I would say that, so this, and that's the theme more or less of the central part of Nietzsche's book,
Genealogy
of Morals. Thank you. Which is that the moral power of debt. Let's put it this way. Yeah, I would say even that debt is a combination of morality, producing guilt and responsibility, but also really a work ethic, in the sense that you have to work to pay your debts. You have to, graduating from law school or medical school, because of the debts you have to earn the kind of money in order to pay those debts. So in some ways, debt, the production of subjectivity through debt, the production of the indebted as a subject, it might be a combination of Nietzsche and Weber, a morality combined with a work ethic, something like that. Okay, so that's the first figure, the indebted. The second figure is what we're calling, what I'm calling with my co-author about this, okay, the mediatized. And part of what I mean by this is the way that our current relationships with media form us, produce a certain kind of subjectivity. So one way that I think you've, seems that I'm sure you've heard, and it makes sense, I think, as a first engagement of this, a kind of lament about the way that media today has made our subjectivity and our relationships more thinner and more superficial. In other words, the more media becomes deeply integrated into our lives, our experiences become thinner. I'm sure you can think of, like, maybe all of our parents say something like this, like that a certain kind of nostalgia for the slowness of writing letters and putting them in the mail and receiving them compared to the rapidity of email, or the way that friending on Facebook has some ways replaced the practices and depth of friendship. Then in some ways, I guess the other one might be about how Twitter, and always saying what you're doing, like being always asked to narrate your life, has replaced in many ways the practices of your own narration of your life that were much deeper. Okay, so yeah, I would say in these regards that it's not really that media makes us passive, that this relationship with media makes us passive. It doesn't really make us active either. It rather demands attention and a certain kind of engagement. So you're called and perpetually engaged by it. You're called to express yourself. You're called to be active in that relationship with media. So all that seems to me a kind of, what do I call it, nostalgic lament that the mediatized has inspired. For me, though, the political problem with media is not so much that the question of activity and superficiality. And neither is the issue of our relationship with media. It's no longer also the question about access to information and expression. So in a previous political era, that was the assumption, or the basic assumption about the relationship of politics to media. The media both excluded us from the information and excluded us from the power of expression. I think in this regard, I find meaningful a passage in an interview with Sheldon, which actually, if anyone's received an email from Marco, is on the bottom of his emails. And it's one where Deleuze says this. He says something like this. I'm paraphrasing him. He says, the problem is no longer getting people to express themselves. In fact, repressive forces today force people to express themselves. The problem today is rather that we need sometimes the right to say nothing, that we need the silence in order to finally develop something worth saying. Now, I'm not sure I totally agree with this last part of it, but what seems to me right about it is that it's not just a question of expression, and it's not just a question of communication, political freedom, political power, but rather requires us to think about different qualities of communication and different qualities of expression. That's what I get from this quotation. Okay, so let me give you one more Marx example, and then I can come to the present. Sorry for all the Marx examples. I'm teaching Marx this semester. Also, I generally have Marx on the break. So, but try to discount that if it bothers you. Here's the example. Whereas in an historical text, writing about French history, about developments in French history, Marx at a certain point says that the peasants in France are not a class and cannot act politically. And what he means by this, which is, from Marx's perspective, a big insult, that they're not a class. And what he means by that is really that they cannot communicate with each other, and that communication would be necessary to act as a class, to act politically. Which is, maybe that part seems perfectly obvious in Marx's argument. The peasants are dispersed in the French countryside. They don't, they're isolated on their small holding plots, and because of their separations, cannot communicate with each other, and therefore cannot act politically. Now, I think it's important that he does, it's not really, what he's talking about communication here, it's not really that they don't have access to the news. Like, it's not as if they knew that Louis Bonaparte, the ruler, was gambling and wasting all his money, etc. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't vote for him. It's a different kind of communication that's necessary. And so for Marx, what he has in mind as the positive role of communication that allows a class to act politically, what he's thinking about is the urban working class in Paris that communicates because it's in the factory together, because it has that even corporeal proximity, that not only they get the news, it's not just a matter of information, it's also that they have the kinds of exchange of being together, And that is that kind of communication that's different and that's qualitatively different. It seems to me that that's one of the things that the encampments and occupations of this year have rediscovered. Rediscover the kind of communication that comes from being together and that allows you to act politically precisely from that corporeal and intellectual interaction. A different kind of communication that's not just with the, that's not isolated, and it's not just a matter of information. Yeah, I guess I would also pose it this way. I mean, I hope this can make sense to you, which is, you know, if it were just a matter of information, it would sort of be easy. But I feel like a lot of political efforts focus just on information. Like, I think if all of you read all of Noam Chomsky's books and all of the WikiLeaks, and so that you were perfectly informed, I don't think that is what is really transformative politically. It's not, information is not really the issue. The issue seems to me is a communication that is deeper and more intensive, that involves the kind of being together that's present in an encampment. Okay, that's what I meant. And that seems to me what, the third, so that was the third. So the first figure I was talking about was the indebted, the second the mediatized. The third one, the securitized, by which I mean living in a security regime. And here I also think of it as a general condition, like the generality of our condition, of our engagement with the media, the generality of our engagement with debt. With the security regime, I mean something quite simple. I mean, it's really remarkable when you stop to think how much information is constantly being collected about you. I mean, it used to be, and I think you take for granted and accept, that in certain institutional situations, there will be a certain kind of surveillance. Like when you're in prison, you accept that there will be surveillance of you. Even when you enter the university, you assume that there will be a kind of surveillance, or certainly when you go into the hospital, when you go on unemployment, they'll question not only about your life, but your efforts and your desires. So you think, and then also, of course, when you go to the airport, you know that that there will be a certain kind of information collected about you, about your body scan and et cetera. Go to certain countries, you'll get the retinal scan, the fingerprints, et cetera. What's different today is it's not just in certain institutions. I mean, this is what previous authors of Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari, a certain generation of authors were thinking about in a disciplinary society, where they thought there are different regimes in which you expect certain kinds of surveillance to happen, and it's specific to that space. When you're in the hospital, when you're in the barracks, when you're in the prison. What's different today, it seems to me, is that the surveillance now has expanded well beyond all of those institutions, so that you're not only surveilled when you're in prison, but even in your classrooms, and even in the street, certainly in the mini mart or the 7-Eleven, or also all of your credit card transactions will be recorded. All of your cell phone conversations can be recorded. All the web pages you visit can be recorded. You might wonder, why is it that we accept this kind of surveillance or generalized surveillance that was previously restricted to the prisons and other institutions. But there's one more point of this, which seems to me that what characterizes the security regime is not only that we're the object of security, the object of surveillance, we're also constantly called on to be the subject of surveillance. You know, that you're called to report suspicious activity in your neighborhood, the seatmate on the airplane when they do something odd. Or, I mean, in some ways, it seems to me that there are two dramatis personae in the security society. There's the inmate and the guard, and you're called on to be both of them at once. That's what seems to me to characterize the security regime, and generalized in a rather universal way. You know, when I say this too, I have a certain hesitation. Let me take a parenthesis. I have a certain hesitation about this kind of theorizing, like recognizing how prison has come to characterize what we used to think of as prison has characterized all of our lives. And that even in the classrooms, I don't even see here, but I assume that here at this university, you also have video cameras in the classrooms. All the places you don't recognize that you're being recorded. Okay, what bothers me, or what I'm hesitating about, even self-critically about this, is that there's a tendency then to act as if we were all in this together and not recognize those who are really in prison and the difference of those really in prison. And in fact, one of the things that I think should be explained, and I'm not sure I have an adequate explanation of it, is why during the same period of the expansion of the security society that I was just describing, and I assume sounds familiar to you, why during that same period there's been an enormous expansion of the actual prison population in the U.S. The figures are easily scandalous about U.S. prison population. Since about 1973, there has been a 5-fold increase of the prison population in the U.S. So 500% increase of those in prison in the U.S. The U.S. imprisons a higher percentage of its population than any other country in the world. And moreover, the racial nature of that imprisonment is dramatic. That an African American has 6 times as much chance of being imprisoned as a white person. In fact, that there are more African Americans in prison today in the U.S. than were enslaved on plantations in 1850. So it seems, first of all, it's a quite dramatic shift. I guess I should say one other thing. In case, I assume not many of you are non-USers or Europeans. When I say this kind of thing in Europe, I feel like I'm worried about what you would call it, self-satisfied anti-Americanism of such things. But I think it's really not much different in Europe than elsewhere. If you think about detention centers of immigrants, they too, if you include them as an incarcerated population, then in Europe it's really not much different, both in the dramatic expansion and in the color of those imprisoned. That it's more or less the same thing. So let me add one more element to that, because I think the security regime is also this, which is that at the same period of this formation of the security regime in the U.S. today, not only an enormous expansion of prison, but also a dramatic increase, if not of the size, of the prestige of the military. There's been a militarization of the U.S. society in the same period. I mean, just to give you an example of that, which seems useful to me, there was a myth in the 1970s that soldiers returning from Vietnam were spit on by protesters and called baby killers. And returning soldiers aren't spit on anymore. In fact, it seems that they weren't even spit on then. It was a myth that was promoted as a way of disqualifying the protests against the war, but nonetheless, I think it's indicative, even the myth, of the low esteem in which the military was held. Whereas today, men in uniform and women in uniform board commercial airliners first, and people thank them for their service, etc. I think that prestige of the military is indicative of a remilitarization of U.S. society in the same period. So what I'm putting together is 3 things here under the securitized. On the one hand, all of us, I think, are part of a semi-military regime of surveillance. I don't mean to sound, I hope it doesn't sound exaggerated, because it seems to me rather recognizable. And at the same time, there's been an enormous increase of the actual prison population and of the prestige of the military. And so all of this seems to me to go together in the subjectivity created in the crisis of the securitized. Okay, I'm going to move on quickly. And here's a question for you. I guess I won't answer it, which is, why do we accept that? Like, why do we accept universal surveillance? And I assume that the main reason is fear. Fear not so much of known threats, but of what Rumsfeld called unknown unknowns. Of things we. But anyway, I'll come back to the fear in a minute. The last one, the 4th figure, and I'll have to run quickly through the inversions of them. The 4th figure, which I'm calling the represented, is in some ways meant to be a summary of the previous 3. So that in one ways we're defined by our indebtedness, by our mediatizedness, by being in the security regime, and also by by the nature of our political engagement being through representation. In some ways, I see this as a summary of the previous three figures, that our inclusion in the electoral system is through representation, but obviously a highly compromised, corrupted form, and compromised and corrupted based on those first three figures I mentioned, that through the powers of finance, through the powers of the media, and through the power of fear. So in all three of those ways, the kinds of political action we have through representations is, I would say, corrupted, but at least limited by that. Now, in terms of representation, it's worth recognizing first that the forms of social representation that functioned in a previous era have in general collapsed or seriously declined. So forms of representation, for instance, through labor unions and political participation through them, participation in political parties, other civil society structures, increasingly it's less possible to participate in the political process through these mechanisms. I also want to point out, this is just a political theory point, but one that seems to me worth making all the time, which is that even if the traditional structures of representation were intact, representation always means, in its essence, a link to, but also a separation from, political power. So even in something like the Federalist Papers, if you're forced to read that in classes, what Madison means by representation, and the point of representation is both, of course, a link to the representatives and the rulers, but also a protection of government from the representative. It connects and cuts. It links and it separates. So the representation is not about political participation. It's a complex figure of both linking and also separating. Now, even regardless of the effectiveness of representation at the national level, one other thing what one needs to recognize is that in the emerging global governance structures, all of those mechanisms of representation are undermined or subordinated. The structures of global governance, for instance, the supranational institutions like the International Monetary Fund, make almost no pretense of representation, or rather a very removed second-order representation or third. NGOs, other effective mechanisms that are part of the global governance don't have even a pretense towards the representation that the national structures do. Okay, so it seems to me that this is one other figure that, yes, not only mystifies our power, but represents us as disempowered subjects. All four of these, that's what I'm thinking of. Now, the second half, which should be a quarter, time-wise, of what I want to say was that these subjective figures of the crisis can not only be resisted, but that they also can be inverted into figures of power. Like the rebellion against them can transform them into something positive. So in each of these regards, it seems to me that the actions of the encampments and the occupations of the last year are and or have the potential to transform each of these. So inverting debt, for instance, it starts, of course, with the way that the protests are refusing debt. One of the slogans I liked in the Italian student movement from a few years ago was, "We won't pay your debt," which is essentially the refusal of the crisis. That making the way that the crisis and austerity programs in Europe and U.S. No much less is a way of forcing us to pay for the debt that they've created. And many other ways that are resisting student rate hikes in the U.S. And in Britain, resisting evictions. These all seem to me ways of resisting the debt. But the key here is not only to refuse the social bonds of money, the social bonds of finance, or the social bonds that debt creates, but also then to create different forms of debt and bonds. You might say a debt in which there's no creditor. Yeah, so whereas, just here's a bibliographical reference. There have been a number of good books about debt in the last year. A point I made earlier about exchange and debt being two ways of seeing capitalist society, that's something that's in a book, if you're interested in that, by David Graeber called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. I think that's what it's called. This point I was just making is in a book by Richard Dienst, D-I-E-N-S-T, The Bonds of Debt, that's what it's called. And his point was really, the polemical point is that it's not that we have too much debt today, we have not enough debt. And what he really means is that we have the wrong kind of debt. What we're lacking is the kind of debt that is involved in the construction of community, the kind of debt to each other that's not a financial debt of creditor and lender, but rather the kind of debts that are both bonds of political relationships and bonds of friendship. Yeah, so it's interesting, or what one should work with here, and I think it's not a coincidence that in English, the word bond is both a financial word and also about a relation. And similarly with debt, that our indebtedness to each other isn't just not just my indebtedness, like I'm indebted to my mom, or that we're indebted to each other in an encampment. It's not an analogy with the financial debt. It's actually that kind of social debt is what is the attachments of community. Okay, and it seems to me that's one way that the indebtedness can be both resisted and transformed. The creation of new bonds, throwing off the morality of the subjectivity of debt, and creating new bonds. It would be a similar thing with communication and media. In some ways, you'd say it's a refusal to be absorbed into the media, to rely on its information. But like I said before, it seems to me that what we need to discover is a real communication that one finds, I would say that one finds in encampment, but one finds in a kind of being together. Like I would say also, it's not just the encampments, but the university occupations. Like if you participated in university occupation or read about others, those two produce a kind of truth, or produce a kind of communication that is different and transforms us from the way that we are absorbed in the media currently. Yeah, I should also put it this way. It's not that I think you need to turn off your TVs or not use Twitter or Facebook. It's rather the relationship to it. Because, of course, all of the movements of the past year have been deeply engaged with social media. The relationship, though, is one in which the social media is a tool of the collective intelligence of being together, rather than the cause of it. Let's put it that way. Okay. Third one then would be about the security regime, and here it seems to me it's a matter of discovering, in the same way as discovering a real indebtedness, or discovering a real communication. Here would be how we could discover a real security. And that starts, of course, by a refusal, like a refusal of the security regime. How do you refuse the security regime? It's often through practices of flight or desertion. Or I think that the figure, the maroon or the fugitive, even the practice of becoming invisible is a excellent first step of fleeing of not being recognized in the security regime. But I think part of it is also, well, and also we would have to put together with that, based on what I said earlier, a fight against the real prison and against the military. I mean, I think I'm very interested in, I think are really useful, these proposals and movements for the abolition of the prison, which goes with a new abolitionism, partly because of of the racial nature of the current prison structures. But more than that, I guess what I suggested before, that the current security regime functions because of fear, that one would have to somehow put an end to the fear that allows us, and by which it functions. So this is one example I wanted to give from the encampments, which you might remember. One of the sort of magical and one of the days I can't quite explain. So if you remember in Tahrir Square, there was one of the days that got a lot of press, was when the thugs of the Mubarak regime came through and beat up a lot of the campers in the encampment. They came through on horses and on camels, which I'm sure would make it a good movie, and to beat up the encampments. Well, so what was remarkable, or what interests me here, is that the next day, the encampment in Tahrir launched the slogan and created signs that said, "We're no longer afraid," which seems to be really remarkable. How can they respond to that, to the violence of the regime, by declaring they're being no longer afraid? I mean, what's really clear, I think, maybe should be to everyone, which is that that statement itself, or that sentiment, "we are no longer afraid," by that statement, the regime crumbles. I mean, that's of course the glue that holds it up. But then in Madrid, there was the same response. So that, Tahrir Square was in January of 2011, and the M15, the May 5th movement started in Madrid, 4 months later. And then what was really different from movements in Spain previously, and I would say this is true of all the encampments and occupations of the past year, is that there was no violence with police and no violence against property. Like, it was quite common in the ultra-globalization movement, and there were, if you participated in it like I did, there were innumerable annoying discussions about who wants to break Starbucks windows and who wants to fight with the cops, etc. And so it was really remarkable, and in Spain it was much more than that, more than in the US. Molotov cocktails, you name it, as part of the general practice of the protesters. What was remarkable in May is there was none of that. There was no, and the explanation the occupiers in Puerta del Sol gave, they said, "We're nonviolent because we're no longer afraid." And I actually don't understand what they meant by that. But I think I think that part of the not being afraid comes from the experience of being together. Like, that part of, in the same way that the encampment creates a different kind of communication, it also provides the possibility of a construction of a real security that puts an end to fear. That's what okay, maybe I shouldn't broadcast things that I don't understand, but that seems, so at least I think it should be clear to you what I'm aiming at in this and the other cases. Like, how can we do, in some ways, the current forms of subjectivity that are created by the crisis are all, I have to call them false forms that are created by our lack of power. So that the way that we are engaged in debt are false debts that make us powerless. The way that we're engaged in media is a false communication that makes us powerless. The way that we're engaged in security is a false security that makes us powerless. And in each of these inversions, which I'm seeing in the movements and in the encampments as means of overturning, is creating a different bonds, different communication, different security that are primarily created through the being together and communication and interaction that they get. So the fourth one, to correspond to representation, and then I'll have to stop, is a refusal of the representative regime that seems to me characteristic also of the encampments. Not all of them, of course, but some of them, and it's the Spanish ones that I'm most interested in really in this. Because one of the slogans in Madrid in May, in Barcelona and Spain in general, was "You don't represent us." Like, it was a refusal of not just the political party in power, but of the representative structure in general. In some ways, they're continuing the slogan of the insurrection in Argentina in 2001, which went on many similar grounds. One of their slogans was "Que se vayan todos," like that they all go, like meaning not just one corrupt politician, or one corrupt party, but get rid of all of them. And by what they meant by that is not just like, let's get rid of this corrupt political class and create a new political class, but rather, let's get rid of this system of representation that pretends to speak for us and create a different system. Now that seems to me related to the rebirth of the discourse of democracy that's been characteristic of the last year of the 2001 encampments. An example of that, obviously in Tunisia and Egypt, the discourse of democracy was powerful, and I would actually credit that with the resonance then in Europe and North America. But in Europe and North America, for quite a while, any self-respecting leftist, meaning any cynical, would have nothing to do with proposing democracy, because democracy is corrupt. Like, by democracy you mean, I don't know, George Bush in his second inaugural address said democracy 86 times. And what he meant by democracy was mostly that other countries would need to somehow bow to the US's will. Like, when you hear the word democracy, you should probably run because the bombs are going to start falling. That's more or less what democracy means. So that it seemed quite naive, I would say, in May in Madrid, that on the first day, in May 15th of the demonstration, a lot of there were people who weren't the experienced activists, who wanted the primary slogan to be Democracia Real Ya, like real democracy now. Which a lot of the experienced activists were embarrassed by. But I think it's a super productive naivete that's been generated throughout the year, a relaunching of democracy as goal and as project, which involves, it seems to me, a critique of representation, and even of the Republican constitutions in general, and a proposition instead of practices of democracy in miniature, like that the assemblies in the squares, the commissions or working groups, all function through a participation which is non-representative or which displaces the structures of representation. And relaunches, like I said, in miniature, practices of democracy through participation. Okay, there you go. So obviously the next question is, how do you move from a square to an Irish society? Like that the movements of the past year have been very good at organizing a square or a limited space. They haven't been very good at expanding them through these democratic experiments, through these practices of security and communication and mutual indebtedness to an entire society. It seems to me, or this would be the next step in my reasoning about this, would be to think about how one could constitute a new social organization based on those three figures, on the notion of social bonds or social debt, the collective intelligence of this communication, and the security of being together without fear. That one would have to move, I guess, towards from the I would say something like this, like from the declaration of these truths to the constitution of a new social order. That would be the next step. But I wanted to end at least with the notion that seems to me already quite consolidated and powerful for the movements of the last year, which is posing the constitution of a real democracy as primary on the political agenda. I'll stop with that. Thanks very much.
That's right, we have 10 minutes, and then instead of occupying Sheldon, we might, all of you who have questions that were not answered in the next 10 minutes, I'm sure that Michael will be willing to speak with people outside in front of the Sheldon, but...
So we have to go actually outside the building?
Well, or at least in the hallway, but so at least out of this room in, but we have 10 minutes, so please.
I apologize for the question. Please, thank you.
I'm looking at the part where you talked about the inversion of
Yes.
figures and crises. And And if I'm following your argument, you're talking about the sense of security which comes from being together at the square, at the present. And that's an alternative way of thinking about security as opposed to the securitized regime.
Yes.
Right? Now, my question is, isn't that a false sense of security as well? Because we are all differently located socially within the square. There are people like Naomi Wolf who've been arrested, and I believe Cornel West was arrested.
Mm-hmm.
But there were also students who went through a lot of torture, UC Davis campus, and they were very lucky because one of the assistant professors resisted that. But how many cases do we have of that where celebrities quote arrest to bring focus to the movement, but they undergo a very different kind of treatment within the securitized regime? And then doesn't that become a false sense of security, the alternative security system, the sense of security, isn't that false as well?
That's good. That's important. In fact, let me add one other thing before yours, because there's another part that seems also when I'm talking about this lack of fear, I don't mean it in the heroic Che Guevara way that says, I know I'm going to my death, but someone else will rise. I'm thinking more of but this is related to your question. It seems to me that when, for instance, in Tahrir Square, when they say, we're no longer afraid, they know they're still going to get beat up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so it's not a security in the sense of, we're not going to get beat up.
Mm-hmm.
It's a security rather in the confidence of our continuation. So it's not, I think the lack of fear maybe would be a different notion of security that doesn't mean a lack, that we won't be submitted to violence. You're absolutely right to point out those differences. I would add to your differences too, that in the riots in London last year, or the ones in France in 1995, which I would link to these struggles in a way. They don't just get pepper spray there. I mean, they shoot live rounds there. So there are different levels of violence in the different contexts. But what I'm trying to figure out here is the way in which what is that constitutes one who faces those who face that violence without fear. It also just adding to that the lack that I mentioned in Spain and elsewhere. I think it's true in the U.S. occupies too, at least in most of them, that the lack of what I would call cliché violence of the demonstrators from a previous era. I mean cliché violence like fighting with cops and breaking Starbucks windows. The lack of that being credited to and thought of in terms of a different security. That seems to me also an interesting one. It's slightly different than the one you were remarking about. I don't know if I'm answering it very well, but I'm thinking in the same lines here. Yeah.
Isn't that what you're referring to in the final chapters of Commonwealth when you talk about laughter of destruction becoming people's fodder and love replacing fear, and in a sense we become monsters?
Yeah.
More love and compassion than.
You're right that it's probably something that Tony, my co-author, and I have been struggling with at different times. What some of you are probably better than me at this, but Paul in Corinthians says something like, talking about love that's stronger than death. But I think that there's something about that same relationship about love that can conquer fear. Right. I guess I would, here I wasn't today, but I think I would try to think of how one could consider love as a political concept that characterizes what's going on in these movements. In those construction of bonds, the construction of right. I bet all of those characteristics about communication and bonds and security could be related to that. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, please. Yeah.
So I have a three-part question.
Sure. I'll get it. Go ahead.
And I'm coming at this from a very different angle, having read quite a bit of Judith Butler and then having taught her some of her work.
Right.
I'm reading what you've said as a set of hypotheses. So I'm entering the conversation as I want to test your hypotheses.
Good.
So with the mediatized characteristic, and with your example of we are no longer afraid, I was wondering that this togetherness that brings people together in some new form of communication, whether we might just call that as being dialogical, they have an opportunity to be geographically located in the same space,
Yeah.
locally rooted.
Uh-huh.
They form dialogical bonds. There's a conversation. But that's also mediated by cell phones and cameras and photographs that are going global.
Right.
And when you say we are no longer afraid, they actually know that that's being heard because it can be heard. It's not Tiananmen Square in China. So I went on Facebook and I heard this, and I was immediately in a dialogical space that erased those geographical markers.
Right.
And what I find problematic about your talk, honestly, is you talk about subjectivities and objectivities, but you actually don't address agency. And agency for me is really important. This is the third part, second or third part, I can't remember.
Okay.
But agency, I think your analysis of security is really simple, in part because we are really fond of things like our GPS systems, of our iPhones that tell the whole world where we're located at any one moment. We are using military discourse to help locate ourselves in time and space. And I think that's a form of agency. So the idea that we're being surveyed or we're objects or subjects of that, I don't think is quite, or explains the whole picture. I think we're actually really active participants of that as agents of our own geographical management. I don't know what you want to call it. And so we have bought into military prestige by adopting and adapting to these kinds of forms of communication. And in fact, when through the invasion of Iraq and being there all those years, we actually saw more communication from soldiers back and forth with the United States than during any other war. And we are agents of that. And so I'm a little bit skeptical, given the dialogical and performative. We're doing speech acts, as we're saying. We don't, if I say I don't fear, someone could be recording this right now and putting it out on Facebook. And then immediately...
It's going on right now, actually.
No, let me try, because I think I'm agreeing with you.
Are you?
Let me try.
I'm not happy at all with what you said, because I think you raised the individual once again, and we should not be doing that in 2012.
Oh, I'd like to erase the individual, but that's not what I wanted to respond about. Oh, by agency you meant the individual.
Well,
Because I misunderstood. Because one thing I would like to say about
collective if it's dialogical, but it can also be individual in the sense that we're individually using our GPS systems to locate ourselves in connection to others.
Right.
So there's this, you're yourself and other at the same time, and every time you post something.
No, I think that's it. You were just very good at describing a certain non-individual type action. But so what it seems to me about the GPS is a puzzle. But the puzzle that so Spinoza says something like this. He says that he's trying to figure out why people often struggle for their servitude as if it were their salvation. And that seems to me what's going on, or at least that's the way I would interpret it. I sort of think you were interpreting the ways in which we participate in, that's what I was trying to describe by being both subject and object to the security regime. It's not, we're not only objects of it, it's not just that we're the passive sufferers of this 1984 kind of gaze. We're also, like you're saying, participants in it, agents if you like. And so part of it is figuring how we could, so when one says, and when one remarks at a different time, or when Spinoza does for that matter, remarks that it's often people struggle for their servitude as if it were their salvation, he doesn't then just throw up his hands and say, well, people are fucked up. It's rather that how could we construct a different process of salvation, a real process of salvation, and that's where I think that you too, I'm happy with this dialogical thing.
Well, it's about insurrectionary speech, as Judith Butler argues.
Right, and I would like insurrectionary action too, not just insurrectionary speech. But yeah, but I'm agreeing with you too. I like insurrectionary